I'm very happy to be opening our concluding session for this conference to talk about a strategic international perspective. We'll be talking to the deans. The first is Professor Boaz Ganor, former dean of the Lauder School of Government Diplomacy and Strategy and currently the founder and head of ICT, and Professor Assaf Moghadam, the current dean of Lauder School of Government Diplomacy and Strategy, who is an international expert on terrorism and violent politics, and as leading scholars on terrorism, which one might think is the #1 threat to the public. Did you ever imagine that a single tiny virus called Corona or COVID-19 will steal your limelight, steal your thunder? Well, I'm waiting for the day when I'll be unemployed. And I always believed that when the day will come, terrorism will end too, and I will be able to learn how to be a cook or teach flower arrangements. So now you might say, well, coronavirus has come around and now suddenly terrorism is no longer important. But it's not true. The opposite is true. It's true that in various places you see some kind of a step back from the importance of terrorism, but it's still bubbling there under the surface. And when the solution will be found and the coronavirus will be behind us, this will come back and more forcefully. Now we're seeing new forms of terrorism, like the extreme right wing and the radical Muslim. And the same terrorist organizations will probably try and use biological terrorism in future. But what's most fascinating is the comparison between the two phenomena. And I call it the two epidemics, the global terrorism epidemic and the coronavirus pandemic on the other, and how you would grapple with these two epidemics, where you can see similarities in challenges and methods of coping. Well, I must say that your basic assumption, your premise, that terrorism was the main threat on the security of humankind, well, I don't really believe in it, because it's my profession to study counterterrorism and terrorism, but I still think that even during the times of 9/11, during that period of time, terrorism was a very important threat, but there were other threats alongside it, a nuclear threat, threats between Russia and other countries that I can't say are less important. And now this tiny virus has allowed us to put terrorism into perspective as a very important threat, and it's very important to focus on it, and I continue to research it. But we must also remember that there are other important threats alongside it, including global warming, nuclear threats, and so on. But I do believe that it's all interconnected. So it's not just a matter of either or. It's not as if terrorism is no longer a threat and it's now being replaced, but instead we must cope with several threats at once. Okay, we are facing the final weeks where it's clear that the government system has failed in addressing the coronavirus crisis. We are #1, unfortunately, for morbidity per capita, and we've heard from Gadi Eisenkot, the former Chief of General Staff, and he said there's no leadership. How do you feel the failure in addressing this crisis has affected our deterrence and how our enemies perceive us? I think that first of all, our enemies and also our friends have been following the way Israel is conducting itself with this crisis very closely. Everyone realized that at the beginning we were doing very well or coped very well with the crisis, and the world has noticed that now things are a little different. I'm not sure whether the way Israel has coped with this crisis has any repercussion on the way that our enemies see us and how our deterrence is. I don't feel that there is a strong link here. I am much more concerned not about the way we coped and how Israel is viewed in light of the coronavirus, but I'm more concerned when it comes to the coronavirus by world jury. Because we see, for example, that in many countries around the world, there are conspiracy theories, there are theories that are trying to connect this crisis to Jews. I think that in the long term, that is a far greater threat. Professor Ganor, I agree with Assaf. I think that the impact is negligent, if any, but there is a huge missed opportunity here, because if Israel, like it did in the first wave, if it were perceived as a leader, as the one that harnesses technologies and develops special technologies, that in itself would have strengthened our image as a regional, omnipotent superpower, and that would have helped us in our deterrence efforts, and that's no longer the case. However, the failure of grappling with the coronavirus crisis is a red flag not for our enemies, but for ourselves, for Israeli society itself. At the ICT, which is the sister organization of IPS, which is the one organizing this conference, we for the last 2 years have been building an emergency preparedness for a scenario like the Second Lebanon War, which we call the Third Lebanon War. And when we built these scenarios, I thought that Israel was in a very complicated situation, given the fact that the scope of arsenal, rockets, and missiles to be launched at the home front, but always, somewhere in there, there was a thought whereby we have someone to count on. It'll be managed properly. It'll be handled well. The coronavirus crisis is kind of an exercise, a kind of a drill that shows that, in fact, we'll be failing, and therefore we need to prepare ourselves for crises that are just as realistic as the coronavirus. Well, if you mentioned the Third Lebanon War, if we're looking at Lebanon, if we're looking at the explosion at the port and Hezbollah and the special court ruling, do you think this arena is now dangerous? I'll tell you, it is always dangerous, because the problem is that when you look at danger or hazardness, you are looking at two things: the enemy's motivation to escalate the situation and their ability to do it. And I don't think Israel has ever faced such a challenge. 150,000 rockets and missiles that are aimed at all of Israel. It's like General Briggs said, it is like an atom bomb, like a nuclear bomb without the nuclear effect. In terms of motivation, well, the question is, when will there be a motivation? There can be one of 3 triggers that will lead to such a war. If Hezbollah decides to wage such a war, which probably won't happen, but what could have happened if its patron, Iran, who gave it this arsenal, will instruct it to start such a war for reasons connected to the United States, Israel, and other things. And a third trigger can be Israel deciding to do a preemptive attack, and I think that this needs to be looked at very, very carefully. And the third option is for Lebanon to go to slip into total chaos, and then as a way out of domestic problems, Hezbollah will begin a process that, by a snowballing effect, will lead to war. And I think that this final option has grown recently, has become increasingly more possible. As for the threat up in the north, I think we should look at Hezbollah as a comprehensive area or in context. As for Hezbollah, I think it is currently in its weakest point in the last 2 decades. And what I can definitely say is that it will not forego its status in Lebanon. Whether it will wage war or not, that is an issue that is more complicated. As for Shiite terrorism in general, I think that now that we have the normalization agreement between Israel and the UAE, Israel is far deeper and far closer to Iran. And if we go back to incentives and opportunities, I think there is now both an incentive for Iran and even greater incentive to attack Israel, but on the other hand, an opportunity as well, because Israel will be closer. The normalization agreement will bring about greater Israeli presence in the region. Thank you very much. I'm so sorry I had to cut you short. I have so many more questions and also interesting, but we have to conclude. Okay, we'll have another conference in a year's time. Thank you very much, Professor Ganor and Professor Moghadam, for this talk. And it is now the end of a fascinating day, so we will now move on to Major General in Reserves, Amos Gilad, the head of IPS, who will say a few concluding remarks and answer some of our audience's questions.